Hi, and welcome to Alive with Chronic Illness, a podcast dedicated to exploring what it's like to live with and not in spite of chronic illness. Saima has joined me today to talk about her experience of Access to Work, which is a grant-based scheme that funds support and equipment for disabled people who are working. Thank you for joining me today, Saima. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Hi, thank you for having me. My name's Saima. I'm visually impaired. I have no vision at all, no light perception, and I was born with my visual impairment. So I have a lot of lived experience of my disability, but I've also worked in the disability sector. I've volunteered for a charity that supports people who are essentially kind of struggling with sight loss, and I've been volunteering with them for 7 years. And as well as that, I've worked to support people to access employment, and I've supported people with a range of disabilities. So, in terms of how that's relevant, I suppose, to access to work, I've obviously had experience applying for access to work myself. I haven't directly supported anyone with the process, but I've been a part of forums where access to work has been a huge hot topic that has been discussed for whatever reason. In terms of helping clients to access employment opportunities, discussing access to work is a huge part of that. And so I've kind of, taken part in discussions around that and supported clients to kind of learn about what they would ask for if they were to apply and to advocate for themselves and things like that.
Brilliant. So you've got some varied experience there. And how did you find the process yourself?
So when I first applied, so I've applied for access to work 3 times. The first time I applied, I was really sort of out of my depth, not because the application process was inaccessible, because it actually is quite accessible, but I sort of assumed it wouldn't be. And I think that says a lot about, I guess, the reputation of certain departments and what we hear about them. I mean, when someone mentions things like DWP, you automatically go, it's not going to be accessible, it's not going to be usable. And I think that in itself it kind of speaks volumes. So when I first did the application, I did it over the phone, and I didn't like it. One of the things that I think comes up with access to work is the inconsistency of the advisor. So when you call up, you get some amazing ones, you get some that not so great. The one I had that was filling out the application, I just felt very because I didn't know much about the process, and she didn't sort of explain anything. She just sort of started filling it out without really explaining what the process would look like. And I felt very kind of on the spot, I suppose. Having said that, I can only talk about a screen reader software point of view. And the screen reader softwares that I use are JAWS and VoiceOver. And if you were to ask me, is the online application screen reader accessible? It is, in my experience. So that's a positive. I think the questions could be better designed. Some of them are just sort of either really repetitive, and it kind of makes you feel like, oh, have I filled this out wrong, or have I? It just sort of throws you a little bit. But yes, I mean, as I say, the online initial form is definitely accessible. So the second and third time that I did apply, I was more comfortable kind of being able to just say, oh, I'll apply online.
Yeah, definitely. And so, you picked up there, that it can be different depending on who you speak to. Do you think it would make the process easier if perhaps there was a caseworker you had right from the beginning of applying that was a consistent person?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's, I guess, the second stage of the application. So, once you've submitted the application, I mean, the wait time at the moment is something ridiculous. Don't quote me on it, but it's something ridiculous. I think it was like 24 weeks. So my my husband's having his application renewed, and he called up to obviously get that renewed. Now you'd think, obviously, when you're in work, you're doing the same job, nothing's actually changing. That would be different. But because he had some issues with his caseworker, so the advisor that he had left, and they passed him over to someone else, and there were so many issues that the caseworker essentially said, right, I'm closing the claim down because you haven't provided me with the evidence and what have you, even though he had, and it turned into a huge mess. Anyways, what that meant was the claim closed down, and so they said, right, well, you've got 24 weeks now until it can reopen. And I think that, in terms of when we talk about application processes, that is ridiculous, because no employer is going to wait around 24 weeks for you to be able to get things in place. And I guess that goes back to what you said about having a caseworker from the beginning. I think if you had somebody that was allocated to you that would support you to fill out your application, and that same person was then sort of with you the whole way through, that would be a lot easier. And certainly more work that needs to be done to kind of reduce that waiting time, because it's awful. I had a client who, so it was a strange one. So he was someone else's client, and the work coach left, and so he got passed over to me. But in essence, he'd already found a job. When he was passed over to me, he'd filled out the access to work form, and he'd had to start his job because the wait time was so long. And then when he was allocated an advisor, the advisor was awful. He really was. And I remember kind of supporting him to speak to the advisor about some of the needs that he had. And the thing is, he wasn't really asking for very much. He just wanted a magnifier and he wanted some screen reading software. I think he wanted Zoom text. Yeah, that's what it was. He wanted Zoom text. And they just weren't cooperative with him. And it was like, well, okay, we'll give it to you, but we feel that this would be better for you. And it was like, well, no, I'm telling you that this is what I need. And I think the thing that was really frustrating for me was the fact that he wasn't very comfortable advocating for himself because he was very new to sight loss. He'd very recently lost his sight, was very, coming to terms with that, but was adamant he wanted to work. And I think, again, this is where, if you can't advocate for yourself, if you're not comfortable speaking up for yourself, it's almost like they sort of trample over you a little bit. It's a horrible way to put it, but it does feel very much like, if you don't have the loudest voice, if you're not constantly on their backs, you get pushed to the side. And unfortunately, he never did actually get the software he needed. Luckily for him, he had a really good employer, but he essentially struggled in that job more than he needed to, took a lot longer to do things because there was no pressure put on them. And I did sort of say, it's about calling them back. And he was like, I'd rather just be patient with it because he just wasn't confident. I think they undermined him enough to make him feel like, oh, do I actually need this? Or can I actually do my job without it? Then, maybe I don't need it after all. And I found that quite, watching that from the outside. And I think with me as well, when I initially applied, I had no support with the process. And I think, again, that's where I think organizations need to kind of be more vocal about it. So, I went to a school for visually impaired people. I then went to a college that had a resource space for visually impaired people. It was a mainstream college, but these things were never discussed. Then went to university, and university careers teams, I didn't have a very good experience with mine in terms of, they were lovely as people, but they just didn't have any disability awareness. So essentially, when you apply for access to work for the first time, it's just never discussed. It's not talked about. You don't know what you're doing. You don't know what you're entitled to. This is a story I share because it's so profound. So my husband's a bit older than me, 9 years older than me, and he didn't know access to work existed at all until we met. So when we met, he was 30. So and he's visually impaired. Up until the age of 30, he didn't even know access to work existed. And that's what I mean about it not being discussed. You go to university, you go to college, you go to university, and then there's this huge gap. You go to all these job centres, they don't mention it to you. The fact that, at the age of 30, and it just happened to be that I mentioned it, he'd been applying for all these jobs thinking that when I get the job, I will have to basically just provide all the equipment myself because he just didn't know it existed.
Yeah, I think that's unfortunately, quite common. A lot of people don't seem to know it exists. I didn't know. I didn't know it existed, and it would have absolutely helped me stay in some of the roles I was in previously had I have known. And it is a real pity that it's not talked about more and that it's not easy to access and there's not a clarity of, well, once you start the process, it's different, but like in terms of actually finding out it exists in the first place and the clarity of what are you entitled to or what could you get access to. I think that would really help, just having a clear layout of what that is so that people know, one, that they can apply, and two, what they may be entitled to.
Well, that's the thing. I mean, you've got that Gov page that talks about access to work. There's a fact sheet there, but if you don't know it exists, why would you look for the fact
Yeah.
sheet? And again, it's very simplistic. It doesn't really break things down very well. I think there needs to be some clarity around, software that does exist. So the one thing that we did when I worked for the charity that I worked for, Bid Services. Oh, well, one thing that I tried to implement anyway was to look at product demonstrations with clients. So when a client would come to me and say, I'm not quite ready for work because I've just lost my sight, or whatever the health condition may be, we wouldn't kind of look at getting them into work straight away. We'd look at, okay, that's fine. Let's take a step back and look at, when you are ready for work, this is the equipment you could use, because often it makes a huge difference to clients believing that they can do something, because a lot of the time it's just misconceptions around, I can't go down this career path because I can't access the XYZ, and actually you can. I mean, even things like, I had a client who, he was born blind, but didn't know that he could access assistive technology on a mobile phone, and so never used a mobile phone. And to the point where I asked him a question and he said, I can't remember what the question was, and he said, how can you be asking me that, when you know perfectly well I can't use the phone because I can't see the phone. And I said, well, okay. And we talked about it, and he just, there's so many things that he just didn't know. And so obviously, to tell someone like that, or to ask someone like that to work for them, that just seems utterly impossible and a little bit kind of insulting, because it's kind of like you're piling salt in the wound, so to speak.
Yeah.
I can't do that. Why are you asking me to do it? Because these things just aren't discussed. And I just find it really, ridiculous that even now schools and colleges aren't discussing this stuff because full well when that person leaves that mainstream or specialist environment, what else are they going to do if not work or get a career or
Yeah.
go into some education, some form of education? Either way, they will encounter something like this. I mean, the same could be said of DSA, which is a whole other conversation that just isn't discussed very well. And again, it's a similar thing, isn't it? Where you've got this grant, but you don't know what you can use it for, and you don't know what you can access. I mean, I feel like we've gone on a bit of a tangent, but I guess your initial question was about applications, and I think the thing is, I think the wait time definitely needs to be reduced drastically because it puts people off from even applying for jobs. If I'm told that I've got a 24-week waiting list, I'm not even going to apply for a job because I don't see the point. I don't want to deal with the back and forth of the employer. I can't start without it because I'm not comfortable. It's going to put people off. And again, like you said, I think there needs to be consistency with advisors. I've had more, bad experiences than good. Even when you call up the general kind of helpline, there's so much kind of inconsistency. Some of them are really helpful, some of them are not, and it's just that needs to be addressed to put people at ease.
Yeah, and it is difficult if you're looking for a job and you're not sure what kind of job you want to be doing, and there might be a lot of different options, and then you take that job and then you're trying to get access to work in place as well. And if you
Mm.
don't get it in, it might actually be the difference between being able to do the job or not.
Yeah, and I think it's hard enough starting a new job, at the best of times. I remember when I started at bid and the first week honestly wore me out. And it's just because it's a lot of new information. But I had to worry about access to work on top of that. Incidentally, the only reason I was able to start at bid the way I did, and that was my second job, that and that was the second time I applied for access to work. The only reason I started was because bid were a disability charity and my access to work wasn't in place for a while. I started in October and the access to work was put in place halfway through January. Now, the
Yeah.
only reason that worked was because they were a disability charity. My manager was hard of hearing. A lot of work coaches were hard of hearing, and so they know the process. They understand how that works, and they were quite reassuring. Now, they actually had to intervene and sort out my taxis for me because I had no travel because access to work wasn't put in place, and nobody's going to give you taxi support without that guarantee that they're going to be paid, are they? Again, the same thing happened with my access assistant, where essentially, luckily, I was, and this doesn't happen. So, that's a caveat. This doesn't happen. I was lucky. The person working there, the other work coach on the team was visually impaired. He had an access assistant and he was only using that access assistant part time. And so he agreed to kind of, offer me a little bit of support here and there. But that's very, on the proviso that, there's no guarantee that he's going to get paid for that. That support's going to be backdated. There's no guarantee that's going to happen. And so if those things hadn't been put in place, would I have been able to do that job? I don't know. If I had not been able to do that job, would I, because that was my, the longest kind of role that I took, would I then have the experience to look at other jobs? That was,
Yeah.
it's huge when you think of it like that. If they weren't willing to do that, would I still be out just unemployed and not have the experience at all?
It's such a massive thing, isn't it? That's such a big
Yeah.
impact that can have just that accessibility.
And there's no guarantee that employers know, and there's no guarantee that, as I say, I was lucky that the employers know how access to work works because they deal with it themselves for BSL interpreters and things like that, so they know, and they were empathetic to that. But while I was there, I did actually end up applying for another job just because I felt like I wanted to sort of broaden my horizons a bit and get some
Yeah.
experience outside of the disability sector. Now, I applied for that job. This was the third time I applied for access to work, so I applied for the job, got the job and essentially applied for access to work and was told, right, there's a 16-week waiting list. Right, what do I do here? They needed someone urgently. But it got to the point where I had to turn the job down because it got too stressful. And I remember the manager saying to me, do you actually want this job? And I said, I do, I really do. It's not me, it's them. But because they'd never dealt with access to work before, it was horrible. I couldn't blame them because they really needed someone to start. They were adamant, there's nothing we can do. It's 16 weeks and that's the waiting time. And it's like, well, I'm going to lose this job. And I chose to then say, look, you know what, I'll stay where I am because it got too much. I wouldn't have been able to start there. Bear in mind, I would have been the only person with a disability on that team. I didn't feel comfortable starting without that access to work in place because the department wouldn't have known how to support me. And it wasn't that they weren't willing, it was just that I didn't feel as supported, as I did when I started bid. And it just, yeah, I ended up turning it down.
Yeah, and then in that way, like the wait times mean that people actually lose out on opportunities, which is
Mm.
just awful. It shouldn't be like that. It should be a quick process. It should be set up so that we can get people into work and help them stay there.
Yeah. And I also think they ought to be a case where, if you've got like a profile, so like, for example, okay, I've applied for work, I've applied for access to work. Why is it that I need to fill out an entire application and state my needs and all of that, when transitioning to jobs? I understand obviously your needs will change, a little bit. So again, when I was working at BID, it was a lot of outreach work, it was a lot of visiting people in the community. That's very different from, sitting in an office. So naturally your needs there will change in terms of what the job requires of you. But, your health condition, all of that, if that basic information was pre-filled and there, that gives you less to do. But it's not
Yeah.
like that. You're starting from scratch. It's like, and that of course increases the wait time, and it means there's more for you, there's more work for you to do as part of that process, I suppose. I just feel like once you've got a profile, you should have a profile.
Yeah.
That just to me surely makes more sense.
Yes, definitely. Yeah, make it a lot easier for everyone,
Yeah.
really. I think it would make the system run smoother as well.
Yes.
So, sort of thinking about that then, what type of evidence did you need to supply when you applied?
Evidence now you're asking me. I'm trying to think. Um, oh goodness. Do you know?
Well, that's a good sign. I suppose it means that it wasn't like too difficult evidence-wise, because I guess whenever I've had to get a lot of evidence for something, I always remember it, like PIP
Yes.
applications.
Yeah. No, honestly, I think it was just a case of a PIP letter and a just a sort of my registration certificate to say that I'm, registered with my eye condition. Don't remember the big and a doctor's note.
Okay, yeah, so
Yeah.
pretty, I guess, the sort of standard
But I mean, that's
details.
obviously when you're diagnosed, that's great. That's all well and good. But if you're
Yeah,
not, but I've got a cousin, she has a health condition, and it's essentially they've had so much trouble diagnosing it. She's got, quite a few health conditions, and it's again one of those things we talk about invisible disabilities, where just because it's not obvious, it doesn't mean it's not there. And she's struggling at the moment, and we've had so many conversations around access to work. But the problem is because she hasn't got a diagnosis, that's making it really difficult for her, just in terms of getting
yeah,
things that she needs. And even again with advisors as well, I think she's been made to feel like, do you really need that? Is that real? Sort of, they don't outwardly say those words, but they do make you feel that way. And I think she's, had loads of issues. I mean, her main issue is, sort of not being, she needs help with travel and transport. And they just don't think that she needs it. And it's difficult, not everyone has a diagnosis,
yeah.
so that you might be going through that process, you might be struggling with that, and then also want to work, and that's difficult. So I was lucky because I had all the evidence, but I know that not everyone has that.
Yeah, and my understanding is that you can still get access to work without a diagnosis. So there should be a system in place that supports those people.
Absolutely, you can, but I think all it is you face one advisor that makes you feel a certain way and you don't want to
Yeah.
apply again. That's all it is. It's not, the system might tell you, I mean, the system tells you how much funding you've got. The funding is there for us to get equipment that we need, but
Yeah.
more often than not, you have an advisor that sort of undermines you and makes you feel like, why do you need that? And the biggest one I get is, well, we're not doing your job for you, and that's not why what I'm asking for. But they can make you feel that way, and I think
Yeah.
that then puts people off applying. And I know in her case, it was just a really bad advisor, and she just now feels like I can't do that. I don't want feel
Yeah.
overwhelmed by it.
Yeah, and like you said, like coming across them saying we're not doing your job for you almost makes it seem like this is some kind of perk and not just something that's essential to actually be able to access the workplace, to put you on an equal playing field of people who don't need adaptations.
And the funding's there. The funding's there for you
Yeah,
to use, and it's not like you're not asking for something that you're not entitled to. And I think that's what people need to realize as well. You are entitled to that.
yeah,
You want to work. You're trying to work, and therefore, that's something that you need. And I think again, it goes back to advisors, doesn't it? I've had it through uni. I've had it, in various settings where somebody's come across one visually impaired person and they think they know them all. So the first ever advisor I had a son who was visually impaired. And so it was a case of, right, you need this, don't you? No, I don't. You need this, don't you? And it's like, well, no, you wouldn't dream of saying to two-sighted people or, fully able people or whatever the case may be in the office, one person works in this way, you must therefore do the same thing. Like you wouldn't, would you?
no, no,
You wouldn't. Some people prefer to jot things down on paper. It doesn't mean the whole office has to. And it's
yeah,
the same with braillists, or same with any kind of health condition, just because you've got experience of one person doing things in a particular way. But I think sometimes people can impose that a little bit and say, well, I think, and it's like, my recommendation is, but the thing is, you know what you need, and you have your own experience. And I think that you have a right to let that inform how you work. Absolutely, I'm open to suggestions. If there's something that somebody's told me about that can make my work better and I just haven't heard of it, I'm, absolutely willing to look at that. But there's a difference between that and then sort of imposing that on somebody. And again, it's not sort of they never say, right, I'm insisting that you do this, or, this is what I'm gonna make you do. It's not about that. It's very subtle, but it does happen, and it's they kind of know how to make you feel like, well, yeah, okay, maybe I don't need this, or and even if they don't do that, it's just frustrating having to argue with them just to get the things that you need, and you having to explain why you need them over and over and over again.
Yeah, definitely when you're entitled to it and you should have the right to access it. And it almost makes it sound like they think that they know your condition and your experience better than you do, which is
Yeah.
obviously not true. So, what support or equipment were you awarded?
So when I applied the first time, again, I didn't know what to ask for, essentially. And I think this is the thing as well. And I say this every time I apply. So I'm kind of in the middle of, I'm sort of transitioning between jobs at the moment. So I'm kind of going through something similar. And the thing is, people don't realize that you have absolutely no idea really what to ask for because you haven't done the job. So obviously now I'm better prepared because I've been through access to work a few times to know this is how I work and this is what I need. When you're going into that the first time round, you don't have a clue. How could you? You've never worked. And so, it's difficult. And obviously that's just one of the things that can't be helped. That just comes with experience. But I think again, what would bridge that gap better is if these things were discussed at universities and schools a lot better, and again, product demonstrations are a huge part of that, so you know what your options are. But I think the first time I didn't have a clue what to ask for, so I asked for a braille note taker that I ended up, that was quite useful.
Yeah.
I asked for JAWS screen reading software. I asked for travel support, and I asked for an access assistant to support me in and around the building. Now that was interesting. So equipment, no problem. They were willing to give me. That was fine. And this has always been the sticking point. Every single time I've ever applied for the job, the access assistant is always the sticking point. And that's when they say to you, we're not doing your job for you. That's not what we're here for. And that's not what you need it for. It's simply because, so again, classic example of people comparing. So the job that I'm sort of applying for now and dealing with at the moment, they said, well, we've got a visually impaired person working in another department. Would you like to speak to them? And I said, I'm more than happy to speak to them. Had a chat with her. She was lovely enough and told me a bit about how she worked. And then they came back and said, right, we're going to give you the exact same thing that she has. And I said, that's not going to work. Again, it's about they don't want to give me an access assistant, essentially. And the same thing happened, as I say, the first time I applied for access to work. It's always the access assistant. Now, just because one visually impaired person doesn't use one doesn't mean that I don't need one. I know I need one, and I
Yeah.
know why I need it. And the main things for me, and I'm very open about this, is my orientation and spatial awareness is terrible. It just is. I'm just not very good. So my husband is the complete opposite of that. We both have no vision at all. We both are, long cane users, but he essentially does all the outdoorsy, like the shopping and stuff. He'd be the one to go and go to the local shop, or
Yeah.
when we walk up to mum's, he essentially leads the way because I just cannot. Have never been able to retain routes very well, and it's not for lack of trying. I can't do it. It's just not
Yeah.
something I'm very good at. And so, for me, to learn a building or several buildings, as the case may be, is very, very time consuming. And so if I have an access assistant that can just kind of get me from A to B, that really helps
Yeah.
just in terms of getting me to and from where I need to be, settled into work and all the rest of it. Then, of course, you've got the issue that not all systems are accessible with speech software. Now, you're not, again, this comes back to not knowing what you need because I haven't done the job, I haven't worked for the company. I can't know whether your system is accessible or not. There are bound to be certain parts that aren't. And so again, that's where an access assistant can assist where you simply can't access something. When I worked for BID that were essentially a disability charity, there were aspects of their forms that I couldn't fill out. They just were not in an accessible format. I needed to fill those forms out, whether that was to register a client, whether that was to refer a client, whatever the case may be. That access assistant would be the one, I would dictate and they would have to fill it out because I simply couldn't do it.
Yeah.
And that's just, the system's inaccessible. The system's inaccessible. There's nothing you can do. But those are the issues I've always had where you've got to really push for that, equipment they'll give you, and that's great. But the access assistant, that person kind of supporting you, is always something you have to unfortunately push for. They're very reluctant to give it to you, but it's, as I say, for me, something I've always needed because of, the challenges that I have.
Yeah. Yeah, and why do you think there's any reason why they are quite reluctant? Is it I guess it's an ongoing cost. Do you think that might feed into it?
Absolutely, but again, it comes back to you knowing what you're entitled to.
Yeah.
There's a grant that you're entitled to that comes up to a certain amount. Don't quote me on the amount because I can't remember the exact figure, but it's about, and interestingly, it's that it's not kind of common knowledge of that, and people don't know that they're entitled to a certain amount, so you feel like, oh, I'm asking for too much, but you're not, because that's the amount you're entitled to. And that's not to say you use every penny of it if you don't need to, but if you need to, it's there.
Yeah.
I think cost is a factor. I also think, again, it's this whole thing of, well, we don't want people doing your job for you, but that's not what I need it for. Quite frankly, if I didn't need it, it'd be a lot simpler because I can just get up and go and do what I want, how I want, and when I want. But I do
Yeah.
need it, and so, and it's not. That's the thing. It's not like when you're working with an access assistant, it's coordinating that. It's coordinating when they're off sick. It's not plain sailing. It's not something I would choose to do. It's something I need to do
Yeah.
because of, as I say, aspects that are visual. But in the case of the job that I'm kind of going to now, as I say, they put me in touch with someone who's visually impaired, and because she does not have one, you don't need one. And it's like, yes, I understand that, but she also told me that she was able to learn her way around the building in the matter of, a couple of weeks. I know I can't do that because I've been in situations where that's just not happened. I can't do it. Also, the building is different to mine. The building that I will be working in is absolutely humongous. It's huge.
Yeah.
And that obviously is a factor. There's no braille anywhere. There's no signage that would support me to be able to learn my way around. And so, and obviously then you've got to account for crowds and things. But, because she never had one and she's visually impaired, you don't need one. And that's sometimes what it boils down to. They just sort of think, well, one size fits all. That just isn't how people work in any context.
Yeah. So the process just doesn't feel very person-centered at all.
No, no, definitely not. It's not person centered. Definitely more needs to be done around that. I think access to work needs to kind of be more, what's the word? I don't want to say present. I know what I mean. I just think, like, again, if they sort of took ownership of organizing, these product demonstrations and giving people a place to go to discuss things. I mean, you've got like access to work forums, but they're set up by access to work users that are, having issues with the process, that are trying to reach out and to support one another. You don't have anything that DWP have set up themselves to support you. There's nothing, not that I'm aware of anyway. I think if they took ownership of that and they took ownership of, these are the products that we kind of endorse and these are the products that we've that people have used and benefited from it, and just give you things to explore so that you can take ownership of that, and so that they're recognizing those differences and not just have one product but have a selection to recognize that these are the things that we have that have supported people in the past. It's not a case of just having one.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that is a big bit of it, isn't it? Just having more clear information, more accessible information about access to work, because there really is a real lack of it.
Yeah.
And that was part of why I wanted like you to come in today and to talk about this, because maybe somebody will listen to it and they'll learn about access to work and they didn't even know they were entitled.
Yeah. I mean,
So
it's interesting that you've said that you didn't know. I mean,
yeah,
like you say, I suppose it's more common than I realized. I mean, the thing is, and I should have mentioned this as well, like, I'm lucky that I have relatives who are visually impaired, relatives that are old, who are older than me, who are visually impaired. And so they must have, at some point had to learn themselves. They must have been at a place where they were the ones that learned. And I don't know how they learned, but I guess I take that for granted in the sense that because they have that knowledge, I benefit from it. But
mm,
had I not had those cousins, where would I be? In terms of, would I have the knowledge of access to work? I don't know, and it's really interesting thinking about it from that angle.
yeah, definitely. And I think I found out from friends as well, sort of people who've gone through the experience. Definitely like disabled students allowance, I found out about when I was at university, because when I applied for student finance, it's on there and it asks you if you're
Yeah.
disabled. So that's the
Yes.
only way though. I didn't actually know what it was. But if I hadn't have applied online or in that way, I wouldn't have even known that that existed or what I was really entitled to.
No, that's, yeah, I guess there's a gap there. I think definitely job centres and education providers need to do a lot more to kind of educate themselves and to be that source of support to people. Because I mean, the other thing as well to mention is, okay, wait times. So, and as I've mentioned, the wait times are ridiculous. Now, I found if you get a charity involved, whether that be RNIB, which would be the the one that we would use if we're visually impaired, but it'd be different depending on your health condition. they sort of tend to, there's always that one person who has a contact or who knows how to escalate things, and conveniently that speed, that waiting list kind of, the wait time goes down, right?
Yeah.
Either way, that's not a guarantee, of course, but it can happen. But it's, again, like, if you don't know that can work, if you don't know that RNIB or whatever charity has that representative, you're not going to call them, you're not going to ask them. If you don't know that there's a way around that, you're just going to go through that wait time and just sit there and wait.
Yeah.
And again, it's exhausting having to call up and say, I want this escalated and I can't be waiting, and it's genuinely exhausting. And I know even within work, when things go wrong, if your support worker hasn't been paid or something like that happens, or your travel hasn't been, your taxis haven't come, or whatever it is absolutely exhausting having to organize time in your day to call them and have that conversation, escalate things all the time, because it just is. And I think it's good that charities do that, but again, not enough people know that can, help. Having that person to advocate for you, to support you with that process, can make a difference. And it's sad that it comes to that additional person being involved and having that conversation with them to kind of escalate things. The fact that they won't listen to you, then
Yeah,
listen to a charity
definitely.
saying it. You know.
Yeah, and I think it's so difficult, isn't it? Like you said, like there's all these different things that can happen. You have to sort out like with payments and things like that. And that in itself, although of course it's a part of access to work, it does add to someone's work week, so to speak. It gives you extra things you've got to do rather than just being able to focus on doing a job.
Yeah, I mean, it's stressful. If your assistant hasn't been paid, that's stressful for you,
Yeah.
because you're thinking, well, if they're not going to be paid, what will happen? And it's not ideal. Again, I mean, on the subject of access assistance, that's a whole other podcast in itself. Honestly, there's so much I could say about that, and I won't. But one thing I will say is, again, I guess it comes back to having in access to work, opening up and giving people access to information. Because, again, when I applied for an access assistant, I didn't know where to look for one. I was floundering. I had they said to me, go and find some quotes for some agencies. They didn't give me any guidance on where to go, who to ask. Ended up using an absolutely awful agency, and it was horrible. It really was. It was just, I ended up getting rid of the person they gave me after about 3 days, because I couldn't do it. It was genuinely that bad. And then
Mm.
you're left like, okay, I've got rid of her. Now what do I do? Where
Yeah.
do I go? There's no guidance on that. So, that definitely, and same with equipment, same with anything. You don't want them to dictate to you, but they needs to be that balance.
Yeah, no, definitely. And a bit of guidance on where you can go so that you've got the choice. So if you look at the guidance and see the people they recommend, and if they work for you, great. If they don't, you know where else you can go and where you can find somebody who's got the experience and training needed as
Yeah,
well.
absolutely, yeah.
So I guess then you kind of touched upon this like throughout the whole thing. And I think advocacy is like one big tip that you've shared, like finding someone, if possible, who can help you advocate and who knows the process, whether that's like through a
Mm.
charity or through someone who's been through it. Is there anything else that you would advise to somebody who is looking to start the access to work process?
Honestly, my advice would be to kind of explore tech before you even get to a place where you're looking for jobs, because obviously you could apply for jobs and not find one for months, but equally you could, there's no guarantee you could find a job, do the first interview and get the job.
Yeah.
I mean, it's funny. When I first started applying for jobs when I graduated, I actually did get an interview for the first job I applied for. Past the interview, the only reason I didn't get that job is because the funding was withdrawn. So it's a funny story. I actually did get the first interview, the first job I ever applied for. I mean, that's just interesting. It doesn't always happen. And obviously I didn't end up doing the job, but it's kind of good to know, isn't it? Like that can happen. So I would say, I think the preparation for access to work starts way before you apply for access to work, because you're kind of stuck then. Once you've applied, it's kind of like you're essentially, you could get an advisor the next day. You probably won't, but you could, and then it's like go go go, and you can't trust them to tell you what's best for you. You kind of need, unfortunately, you kind of need to go in there knowing what you want and why you want it, and being able to justify that when you're challenged on it. And I think that's really important. When you're challenged on it, be really clear and justify why you need that piece of equipment or tech or whatever the case may be. So I think, yeah, definitely, like, start exploring tech as soon as you kind of can. Once the access to work process has sort of started, once you've done the application, you know, I, again, maybe even before that, find a charity that or find a service that can advocate for you, that can support you with that wait time, because there will be a wait time. Find a service that can support you with that if need be. Just, I don't know, it's difficult, isn't it? Like, again, the biggest tip, again, like you said, it goes back to advocacy. I think the biggest one is just be able to be clear
Yeah.
about what you want and why you want it. I think that's the most important thing that you can do.
Yeah, I think so. I think that's a really good tip. And prepare before you even apply. Just have that information ready, and try and find as much information as you can in advance of what you need and why you need it in case you are questioned on that.
Yeah, and like I said before, it's difficult because like, you're not always gonna know when you, especially when you've never worked or even when you go into a new job. There's no guarantee that that there won't be any extra things because your duties and responsibilities are kind of, they're given to
Yeah.
you as a list, but you don't know, like you just, until you're doing it, you don't know, and it's frustrating. But I think the best thing to do is take those duties and responsibilities and just do what you can with them and just try and think, it's unfair that you have to kind of almost foresee what you will need, but I think the best thing to do, like you say, is to start that prep early because and not kind of trust them or put it on them to recommend things to you because that's doesn't work. I think you've got to
Yeah.
be able to kind of know what you want and be able to justify it. If you've got a great advisor and a good relationship with your advisor, brilliant. That doesn't always happen. Again, be aware of like the kind of modes of access as well. So when they don't tell you things. When I initially applied, I mean, this has changed now. So the whole system's online now. You've got an online portal where everything's submitted, and that's great.
Yeah.
When I applied, I was using paper-based forms the whole time, which obviously aren't accessible for me. It was getting someone else to fill them out and all of that. I didn't know there was anything different, and I was posting them off. And obviously, things would get lost in the post. So there were times where people weren't paid, or my
Yeah.
taxis weren't reimbursed because they'd got lost in the post. And then it was just a conversation I had with a cousin, and he said, you can email them in. And I said, nobody ever told me this. No advisor has ever told me I can email off my forms. And it's
Mm.
like, why on earth wouldn't you tell somebody that? Like it's just one of the things that you surely would say, right, this person's visually impaired. Post probably isn't going to work. Maybe we should explore other options, but they don't. And it was only when my cousin told me that this, and I remember thinking, are you sure? Like, this doesn't seem right because nobody's mentioned this. Is he wrong? Like, what is this? Of course, I sent off my first form and it worked. It was fine. And ever since then, I'd done that. And as I say, now things have moved over to the online platform. But just be aware that unfortunately, they don't tell you everything. And I think that's why I guess the other tip is to find a support group of people who've applied for access to work, you know, with a similar health condition to you and just really learn from them before even, as I say, even applying for work or even getting to that point. Just learn as much as you can from them so that you know all this stuff.
Yeah, and I think that like you said there's things you just don't know about, like that you could email it, which is a lot more accessible and just makes a lot more sense. But
Yeah.
if you don't know somebody who knows to tell you, you don't always have that information. And it does come down to that lack of sort of person-centered element of when they're advising you, when they're speaking to you, not taking into account everything and just sort of giving I guess, a one-size-fits-all answer, perhaps.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for coming on today and for sharing everything and your experience.
No, thanks for having me, and I hope people benefit from it.
I definitely think they will. And maybe somebody listens to this and decides to apply for access to work who didn't even know it existed.
Yeah, and hopefully they learn something.
Thanks for listening to today's episode. To learn more about access to work, visit the links in the description or visit the UK government website and search Access to Work.